Flash games were an integral part of my generation. Nearly everyone I know has some memory of passing a lazy afternoon whittling through waves in Warfare 1917 or Bloons Tower Defense, trying to beat our personal bests in Ragdoll Laser Dodge, or letting lunch periods slip by in an instant because we were too focused on making the perfect Line Rider course. I personally have sunk many hours of my life into Flash games. And though I haven't played nearly as many in recent years, there was always a comfort in knowing that I could log on to Congregate and find something to play whenever I was bored and had some time to kill. But soon that comfort is going to slip away. On December 31st, 2020, Adobe will be, or depending on when you are watching this, has been, discontinued and no longer supported. This is seen by many as the final nail in the coffin for the service, which was already beginning to be phased out on a number of modern browsers. Which is not surprising, considering that Adobe Flash Player has always been a pretty buggy, unsafe, and unreliable plugin that has been outdated for years. Though it is still rather sad to see it go, considering that many games that relied on the plugin will now be significantly more difficult or even potentially dangerous to access. So now that many of the games that I grew up playing have a shelf life, I wanted to indulge my nostalgia and take my favorite Flash game for one last ride. RPG shooter Starwish is probably the most generically named game of all time. And with its rough early 2000s anime aesthetic and side-scroller shooter gameplay, I can understand why it's not as widely remembered as something like Fancy Pants Adventure. But if you look past all that, or genuinely enjoy it, you'll find a game I can only adequately describe as genuine. Genuinely surprising, genuinely challenging, and genuinely emotional. I'm not ashamed to admit that when I finished this game back in 2012, I cried. That's because this seemingly simple and generic Flash game has one of the most effective and emotionally resonating narratives of pretty much any game I had played up until that point. Not just out of any Flash games, mind you, but out of any of the games I had played. You see, despite appearing to be nothing more than a standard shoot-'em-up, RPG shooter Starwish, which I'm just going to call Starwish from now on, actually has a little bit more going on beneath the surface. The core gameplay loop is pretty similar to many other 2D shooters. Pick a stage, fly through it from left to right, blow up baddies, and avoid taking damage from projectiles and obstacles. Destroying enemies and bosses nets you experience points and moolah. Spend XP to boost personal stats such as offense and defense, hence the RPG, and spend moolah to upgrade your ship and weapons, hence the shooter. What really sets this game apart from others in its genre are the visual novel and light dating sim-esque elements. After you clear a stage for the first time, you can go to the cafe, where you get to talk to the other characters, get to know them better, learn about their past, and see them interact with a player character. It's very reminiscent of Mass Effect. These interactions, as well as certain actions you take over the course of the game and even what difficulty you play on, directly impact the ending you get. Now, a system like this only works if you have a story worth experiencing and characters worth getting invested in. So, good news! Starwish has both in spades. The story revolves around the player character, Deuce, who is the commander of a space pirate vessel, and his ragtag crew of societal rejects as they go head-to-head with the Galactic Federation, and get pulled into events far beyond anything they've ever encountered. It's not the most original setup in the world, but I still think it's one that works really well. And I am a sucker for space pirates. Speaking of space pirates, let's talk about the characters. The PC, Deuce, is a pretty typical protagonist. He's a cocky, hot-headed wise-ass, a bit of a perv, completely oblivious to the feelings of the people around him half the time, but he's ultimately well-meaning and a pretty good guy at the end of the day. As he is a commander, he is a fairly experienced pilot, but the game makes it abundantly clear that he is not the best of the best. and he's pretty casual with his crew, almost never pulling rank unless it's to try getting out of something. The story opens up with Deuce's fighter getting shot down as he defends his home ship from a Federation capital ship, leading him to crash land on home planet, where he is rescued by Ginny, a kind and exceptionally polite girl working as a technician at a local farm. After she manages to repair Deuce's ship, he recruits her to be the home ship's new engineer. Once the two rendezvous with the crew, we are properly introduced to the rest of the colorful cast of characters. First up, there's Tess, the ship's doctor, who is a childhood friend of Deuce's. The two are exceptionally close, and it's apparent pretty early on that Tess harbors feelings for him. But she's conflicted since the two consider each other like siblings, having both been raised together since their parents' deaths. The man who raised them is Swig, the ship's main gunner, who is an alcoholic panda. While he seems like little more than comic relief at first, he turns out to have a very tragic backstory. And though he is Deuce and Tess's guardian, he acts much more like a casual friend with them rather than a role model or anything like that. And he fills in the role of fun drunk uncle, or drunkle if you will, pretty well. Filling out the rest of the crew, we have Deadeye, the quirky weapons specialist who handles all weapon upgrades, who is a bit of a mad scientist type, always looking to make better weapons, often testing them dangerously close to Deuce. She's a wonderful oddball and easily my favorite character. Then there's Johnny, the ship's communications officer and primary cook. He's a super chill dude who gives hints in-game to help you figure out how to impress your colleagues. He's a skirt chase and flirt, and he's always trying out different get-rich-quick schemes. He is also the king of the Stepford smile. And finally there's Mare, the hotshot pilot who outclasses Deuce in every way. They're an enigmatic professional loyal to the captain above all else, and they meet Deuce's every attempt at idle chit-chat with icy silence. Now that's everyone you can interact with at the start of the game, but obviously there is quite a bit more here to each character than what I've said. That's also not every character in the game. There's even one more crewmate you pick up in the late game that I don't want to spoil here. Yeah, that's right. I don't want to spoil a 9-year-old Flash game. That's pretty wild all on its own, but it's especially crazy for someone like me who really doesn't give much of a damn about spoilers in general. But I really believe that characters in a story like this are best experienced firsthand, or at the very least secondhand by watching through all their story scenes rather than through some kind of recap. Each character has more to them than you might expect at a first glance, and the story, while not flawless, is told effectively enough that it at least got a genuine emotional response out of me. Honestly, as far as the story goes, I really have no complaints. Sure, it has its fair share of tropes and cliches, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Tropes and cliches are tools for telling a story, and if used improperly, they can drag an experience down. But if they are used properly, then they can be very effective at producing the right reactions and conveying the right ideas. And I think Starwish nailed that. Nothing that was done with this game hasn't been done before, but everything that was done here was done very well. Truth be told, my only real issues with this game are with the gameplay itself. I don't mind 2D shooters, but I tend to get bored of them fairly quickly, and since this is an RPG shooter, that means there is a lot of grinding if you want to get through this game without too much hassle. That means replaying the same levels over and over again in order to get the XP and moolah you need, which gets really old really fast. Doubly so since there are 3 areas in the game, and each area has the same number of stages that are all reskins of the same theme. Granted, the level layouts are different for each, but the bosses are the exact same, with only their 3rd variant having new moves to change things up a little. This means the shooter sections tend to overstay their welcome quite a bit, but I still think it's bearable since there is a decent amount of variety among the enemies and the weapons available to you. Still not great, but not terrible by any means. And if getting through these stages is the price to pay for getting more of the story and character interactions, I think it's a fair price. Though my lenience only goes so far. In order to unlock the best ending in the game, you have to qualify for every other ending simultaneously. This honestly wouldn't be too bad if it wasn't for one of them. In order to get one specific ending, you have to beat 2/3 of the game on the hard difficulty without dying even once. Now that might not be so bad if it wasn't for two things. First is the autosave. The moment you die, the game saves. So if you get in a bad spot or you make a mistake, you have to exit the battle or the game immediately before you die. And given how quickly things can go wrong and how much you have to keep track of on screen in 2D shooters, that's much easier said than done. So if something goes wrong, you're very, very likely going to die. And if you do, you have to restart the game from the beginning. Gratefully, the levels are not terribly long and you can skip dialogue, but it is very easy to die, even if it's just to bad luck. Which means if you're trying to go for a deathless run, you might have to restart this game many, many times. The second thing that makes it so frustrating is the difficulty spikes. Between each of the 3 areas is a special boss. When you defeat the boss, you get immediately ushered into the next area, closing off the previous. And each subsequent area is a significant difficulty spike. You can usually get through the first level or 2 in a new area alright if you've been keeping up with your upgrades, but all too often one of the next ones will throw something at you that you just aren't prepared for. It can sometimes feel infuriatingly unfair. And there is one more frustrating thing with unlocking the best ending. In order to qualify for every ending simultaneously, you need to talk to every single character as much as possible. This means talking to them in a very particular order and never missing a single day. During my playthrough for this video, after many attempts to survive through the majority of the game without dying, then after actually completing the game, I realized I missed talking to Deadeye one day, thus locking myself out of her ending completely. Now this upset me for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I spent longer trying to get the best ending than I would care to admit, and locking myself out of it for something so minor left a bad taste in my mouth. Secondly, Deadeye is my favorite character, so the fact that I missed out on her ending feels like the universe directly insulting me for my mistake. So yeah, I walked away from this one a little bitter. But ultimately, that doesn't matter all that much. I still had a great time with this game 9 years ago, and I still enjoyed myself this time around. I can overlook a lot of the flaws present because, and I cannot stress this enough, this is a Flash game. Flash games are basically the indiest of indie games imaginable, made on garbage tier software which was already 15 years old when this game was released. And this game has more content to it than most people would expect, and has a better story than it has any right to. Since the first time I played RPG shooter Starwish back in 2011, it has never fully left my mind. I still think about the characters from time to time. I still chuckle at many of the jokes, and I still feel the emotional beats. It may not be the greatest story ever told, and it's certainly not the greatest game I have ever played. But for what it is, I still believe that this is the greatest Flash game that I have ever played. You know, it kinda hurts, knowing that Flash games like this aren't going to be part of the childhoods of future generations. Sure, there will be other games available online through other software, and many Flash games will still be available through conversion projects such as Blue Maxima's Flashpoint. But the simple truth is that many Flash games are going to be either lost or forgotten as time goes on. And without the ease of being able to find a game site on the first page of Google and have thousands of games available in an instant, many people are never going to get around to playing these games again. Most people just don't want to put more than a few minutes of effort into playing a game. And even more people don't want to have to download extra nonsense just to play random games from the internet. I mean, kids sure as hell aren't going to go through that effort. So while the death of Flash doesn't necessarily mean the death of all Flash games, it does mean that the number of people who are actually going to play them is going to decrease dramatically. And in time, they may just become nothing more than relics of a bygone age of the internet. And while there are plenty of garbage games that might deserve to be forgotten, it's the gems like Starwish that I'm going to miss. But no matter what happens, at least I'll always have fond memories of this and so many other games that gave me joy. So as we come upon the end of Flash's life, I salute the games that will unjustly fall with it. And I will forever be grateful for all the time I got to waste playing them. Deadeye Best Girl, don't at me.